What if I told you that the thing you think you can't control is actually controlling everything about you? Your focus, your energy, your confidence, even the way you see yourself when no one is watching. And here's the uncomfortable truth: lust isn't just a harmless urge, it's a pattern, a loop, a neurological habit that's quietly draining your mental clarity and replacing discipline with distraction. But here's why you need to stay with me until the end. I'm not going to tell you to just stop or use willpower. That doesn't work. What I'm going to show you are 5 science-backed steps that actually rewire your brain so that lust stops feeling powerful in the first place. Because once you understand how it works, you don't fight it, you outgrow it. Let's start with something most people ignore. Lust feels powerful because it hijacks your brain's reward system. Every time you indulge in it, whether it's through thoughts, content, or behavior, you release dopamine. And dopamine doesn't just make you feel good, it teaches your brain what to repeat. So over time, your brain starts associating boredom, stress, loneliness, even success with the same response. Seek pleasure immediately. That's not desire, that's conditioning. And if you don't break that loop, it doesn't just stay the same, it gets stronger. So, step one is awareness, not passive awareness, active awareness. You need to start catching the exact moment the urge began. Not 5 minutes later, not after you've already acted on it, but at the trigger point. Is it when you're alone, late at night, scrolling on your phone? Because once you identify the trigger, you take back control of the timeline. Step two is where most people get it wrong. They try to resist. Resistance doesn't work long term because your brain hates emptiness. If you remove a habit without replacing it, your brain will go right back to it. So instead of saying, don't do this, you say, do this instead. That could be movement, a cold shower, a short burst of exercise, even stepping outside for 5 minutes. The key is immediate replacement, not delayed discipline. Step three is building systems, not relying on motivation. Motivation is unreliable, systems are predictable. If your environment makes it easy to fall into lust, private space, unrestricted internet, constant triggers, then you're fighting an uphill battle every single day. So you redesign your environment, limit access, change routines, remove triggers, make the wrong choice harder and the right choice automatic. Now, here's where it gets deeper. Step four is energy redirection. That urge you feel, it's not just sexual, it's energy, raw, unfocused energy. And if you don't direct it, it will default to the easiest outlet. So you channel it into work, into fitness, into building something that actually moves your life forward. Because the same energy that feeds lust can also build discipline, confidence, and purpose. And finally, step five, the most important one, identity shift. If you keep telling yourself, I'm trying to stop, you're still identifying as someone who struggles. But when you shift to, I'm someone who's in control, everything changes. Your decisions align with that identity. Your habits reinforce it. And over time, lust doesn't feel like something you're fighting, it feels like something you've outgrown because you're no longer the same person. So this isn't about suppressing urges. It's about understanding them, rewiring them, and rising above them. And when you do that, you don't just kill lust. You take back control of your mind, your energy, and your future. Lust feels powerful, but the reality is that what you're experiencing is not strength, it's a very precise manipulation of your brain's reward system. When you encounter something sexually stimulating, your brain releases dopamine, a chemical designed to reinforce behaviors necessary for survival. Was never designed for. Instead of responding to real connection or meaningful experiences, your brain starts reacting to artificial triggers, images, thoughts, quick hits of stimulation that require no effort and give immediate reward. Over time, this creates a loop where your brain begins to prioritize instant gratification over long-term satisfaction. And the more you feed that loop, the more your baseline for pleasure changes. Things that used to feel rewarding, achievements, relationships, personal growth, start to feel dull in comparison. Ultimately, because they don't deliver dopamine as quickly or as intensely. What makes this even more dangerous is how subtle it is. You don't notice it happening in real time. It feels normal. It feels like a choice, but neurologically, it's closer to conditioning. Your brain is learning, adapting, and reinforcing patterns beneath your awareness. This is why willpower alone often fails, because you're not just dealing with a decision, you're dealing with a rewired system that's been trained to seek the easiest reward available. And every time you give in, you're not just satisfying an urge, you're strengthening a neural pathway that makes the next urge harder to resist. It's like carving a deeper groove in your brain, making that behavior more automatic and more dominant over time. At the same time, there's a psychological cost that people rarely talk about. When your actions consistently go against your intentions, it creates a gap between who you want to be and what you actually do. That gap slowly erodes your self-trust. You start questioning your discipline, your control, even your identity. And this isn't about guilt, it's about alignment. When your behavior is driven by impulse instead of intention, you lose a sense of ownership over your own mind. And that loss of control doesn't stay isolated, it spills into other areas of your life. Your focus weakens, your motivation drops, and your ability to delay gratification the very same. That drive success starts to decline. But here's the key shift. Lust only feels powerful when it operates unconsciously. The moment you begin to understand what's happening inside your brain, it starts to lose its grip because you realize it's not some unstoppable force, it's a learned response. And anything that's learned can be unlearned, reshaped, and replaced with something stronger, more intentional, and more aligned with the person you actually want to become. When people talk about lust, they often frame it as a moral issue or a lack of discipline, but that completely misses what's actually happening inside your brain. This isn't just about desire, it's about dopamine, the same neurotransmitter involved in habits, motivation, and addiction. Every time you engage with something sexually stimulating, your brain releases dopamine not just as a reward, but as a signal that says this is important. Remember this, do it again. Over time, your brain starts building strong neural pathways around these behaviors, making them faster, easier, and more automatic. What started as a choice slowly becomes a default response, especially during moments of boredom, stress, or emotional discomfort. The problem is that modern stimulation is not natural in its intensity or accessibility. Your brain evolved in an environment where rewards required effort, connection, pursuit, patience. Now, you can access highly stimulating content instantly, repeatedly, and in unlimited amounts. This overwhelms your dopamine system. Instead of small, balanced releases, you get repeated spikes. And when your brain experiences those spikes frequently, it begins to adapt by reducing sensitivity. This is called downregulation. Essentially, your brain turns down the volume so it doesn't get overstimulated. But here's where it gets dangerous. When your sensitivity drops, you need more stimulation to feel the same level of satisfaction. Choose to be enough no longer feels exciting, so you seek more intense, more frequent, or more novel stimuli just to get back to that same feeling. This is how the cycle deepens. It's not that your desire is increasing naturally, it's that your brain has been trained to need more to feel less. And at the same time, everyday activities, studying, working, socializing, start to feel less rewarding because they can't compete with those artificially high dopamine spikes. This also affects your ability to focus. Dopamine isn't just about pleasure, it's about attention and motivation. When your brain is constantly chasing quick rewards, it becomes harder to engage in tasks that require sustained effort. You might notice that your attention drifts more easily, that you procrastinate more, or that you struggle to stay consistent with goals. That's not laziness, that's a rewired reward system prioritizing immediate gratification over long-term outcomes. Another layer to this is the loss of control. Because these pathways become so strong, the behavior can start to feel automatic. You don't consciously decide every time it just happens. You reach for your phone without thinking. You follow the same patterns even when you've told yourself you won't. And afterward, there's often a sense of frustration, not just because of the action itself, but because it feels like you weren't fully in control of it. But understanding this changes everything, because if your brain can be conditioned in one direction, it can also be conditioned in the other. Neuroplasticity works both ways. The same mechanism that strengthens these habits can be used to weaken them. When you reduce exposure, interrupt the pattern, and stop reinforcing those dopamine spikes, your brain slowly begins to reset. Sensitivity starts to return. Simpler things begin to feel rewarding again. Focus improves. And most importantly, that sense of control starts to come back, not because the urges disappear instantly, but because they no longer dominate your behavior in the same way that moment you begin to change your relationship with lust is not when you eliminate it completely, but when you learn to see it forming in real time. Most people only become aware of their urges after they've already taken over, when the behavior is already in motion and control feels out of reach. But by that point, your brain is already deep into the pattern. Awareness has to happen earlier at the trigger, at the first subtle shift in your thoughts, at the moment your attention starts drifting in a certain direction, because lust doesn't appear out of nowhere. It follows a sequence. There's always a cue, even if it feels small or insignificant. It might be boredom when you're alone, a specific type of content while scrolling a certain time of day, or even an emotional state like stress or frustration. These cues are powerful because they've been paired with reward so many times that your brain automatically connects them. You don't consciously decide to feel the urge. Young brain predicts it based on patterns it has learned. That's why awareness is not just noticing the urge, but understanding the pattern behind it. You start asking yourself, what happened right before this? What am I feeling right now? Where am I? And what am I doing? The more you observe these details, the clearer the pattern becomes. And once you see the pattern, you interrupt the illusion that it's random or uncontrollable. It becomes predictable, and anything predictable can be managed. There's also a critical window of time that most people overlook. Between the trigger and the action, there is a brief moment where your brain is still flexible. The urge is there, but it hasn't fully taken over. This is where awareness gives you power. If you can recognize the urge in that early stage, you can pause. Even a few seconds of conscious recognition can weaken the automatic response. You're essentially stepping out of autopilot and re-engaging your decision-making. That your brain doesn't want you to pause. It wants to move quickly from cue to reward because that's the most efficient path it has learned. So it will try to justify the behavior, minimize the consequences, or convince you that it's harmless just this once. These thoughts can feel very convincing because they're part of the same loop. But when you're aware, you start to see those thoughts for what they are, not truths, but triggers designed to keep the pattern going. Awareness also removes the emotional intensity from the urge. Instead of reacting with frustration or guilt, you begin to observe it more neutrally. You notice the physical sensations, the thoughts, the impulses without immediately acting on them. And paradoxically, this reduces their power. Because when you stop fighting the urge and start observing it, you create space between you and the behavior. You're no longer inside the urge or watching it. Over time, this changes your entire relationship with lust. It stops feeling like an overwhelming force and starts feeling like a signal, something that arises, peaks, and then fades if you don't feed it. And the more consistently you catch that early moment, the weaker the pattern becomes, until what once felt automatic begins to feel optional. What most people misunderstand about breaking any habit, especially something as deeply ingrained as lust, is that resistance alone is not a long-term strategy. Telling yourself don't do this might work for a short period, but your brain doesn't respond well to suppression. When you try to block a thought or an urge without giving your mind an alternative direction, it actually increases the intensity of that urge. This is because your brain is wired to seek resolution, not emptiness. If you remove a pe, er, ave, yeruche, en yeru, a krakoi source of stimulation, and replace it with nothing, your brain will keep returning to it, trying to complete the loop it has learned. This is why replacement is far more powerful than resistance. Instead of Creating a void, you redirect the pathway. When the urge appears, your goal is not to fight it head on, but to immediately shift into a different behavior that satisfies the brain's need for action and engagement. The timing here is critical. If you wait too long, the urge strengthens and the pull becomes harder to override. But if you act quickly within that early window, you can reroute the pattern before it fully activates. The replacement behavior doesn't need to be complicated, but it does need to be effective. It should involve some level of physical or mental engagement that interrupts the state you're in. For example, sudden movement can be incredibly powerful. Doing push ups, going for a short walk, or even just changing your physical environment forces your brain to shift gear. Physiology changes, your focus moves, and the urge loses momentum. Similarly, engaging your mind in a task that requires attention, like solving a problem, reading something productive, working on a goal, can redirect that energy into something productive. Cold exposure is another example that works not because it's extreme, but because it creates a strong sensory shift. When your body experiences a sudden change like cold water, your nervous system responds immediately, pulling your attention out of the loop of craving and into the present moment. It's not about punishment, it's about interruption and reset. What's important here is consistency. The first few times you replace the habit, it might feel forced or unnatural. That's expected because your brain is still wired to follow the old path, but every time you chat and neuroikrakoi behavior, you're weakening the old neural pathway and strengthening a new one. Over time, this strengthening a new one. Over time, this new response becomes more automatic. The urge still appears, but your default reaction begins to change. There's also a deeper psychological shift happening here. When you successfully redirect an urge, even once, to rebuild trust in yourself. You prove that the urge doesn't control you, you can respond differently. And that sense of control is incredibly important because it reinforces your ability to make intentional decisions rather than reactive ones. Eventually, the goal is not to eliminate urges completely, but to change what they lead to. Instead of triggering a cycle of distraction and regret, they become a cue for action, growth, or movement. The same signal that once pulled you down starts pushing you forward because you've trained your brain to associate that moment with a different outcome. Most people rely on motivation to control their behavior, but motivation is inconsistent by nature. Some days you feel strong, focused, and in control. And on other days, especially when you're tired, stressed, or alone, your discipline drops and old patterns take over. That's why if you're trying to overcome lust purely through willpower, you're putting yourself in a position where you have to win the same battle over and over again. Eventually, you'll lose not because you're weak, but because the system you're relying on is unreliable. Real lasting change comes from building systems that make the right choice easier and the wrong choice harder, because your environment shapes your behavior far more than your intentions do. If you're constantly surrounded by triggers, unfiltered content, unrestricted access to your phone, too much idle time, then your brain is being pushed toward the same loop again and again. You're not just fighting your urges, you're fighting your surroundings. So the shift here is from control to design. Instead of asking, how do I resist this? You start asking, how do I make this harder to access in the first place? That could mean putting limits on your devices, using website blockers, or even changing where and how you spend your time. If you know that late nights alone with your phone are a trigger, then the solution isn't just to be strong. To remove or reduce that situation entirely, you can set boundaries like keeping your phone out of reach when you sleep, or replacing that time with a structured routine that doesn't leave space for mindless scrolling. Your physical environment matters just as much. The spaces you spend time in should support the version of you you're trying to become. If your room is associated with isolation and payeri ve yara che and yara ye habits, then small changes like rearranging it, adding light, or using it only for specific activities can start to break that association rest from stimuli.
Ah!
When everything happens in isolation, it's easy for habits to stay hidden and continue unchecked. But when there's some form of external structure, whether it's a friend, a mentor, then we can say that structure is a necessary part of the process. Automatic actions less or even tracking your own behavior, you introduce a level of awareness that makes automatic actions less likely. You're no longer operating entirely on autopilot because there's a layer of reflection involved. Routines are also key. The more structured your day is, the less room there is for impulsive behavior. This doesn't mean filling every minute, but it does mean having clear anchors times for work, movement, rest, and focus. When your brain knows what to expect, it's less likely to seek random stimulation to fill gaps. Unstructured time, especially when combined with easy access to triggers, is where most people slip back into old patterns. Over time, these systems reduce the number of decisions you have to make, and that's important because decision fatigue is real the more likely you are to eventually choose the easier option. But when your environment, routines, and boundaries are already aligned with your goals, you don't have to constantly fight yourself. The path of least resistance starts working in your favor. What once required effort begins to feel automatic at a deeper level. What you're dealing with isn't just an urge, it's energy. And that energy doesn't disappear just because you decide to ignore it. If it's not directed, it will always find the easiest outlet, which is usually the same pattern you're trying to break. This is why simply trying to suppress lust often backfires. You're not removing the energy, you're just delaying where it goes. It hasn't been given a productive direction. That same and given a productive direction. That same energy, however, is incredibly powerful when it's redirected. It's the drive behind ambition, creativity, physical performance, and focus. The difference is not in the energy itself, but in how it's channeled. When you start to consciously redirect that energy into something meaningful, whether it's exercise, building a skill, working toward a goal, then you can start to see a shift in your energy. Or even pushing yourself mentally, you begin to transform what used to feel like a weakness into something that actually strengthens you. Physical activity is one of the most immediate and effective ways to do this. When you engage your body, especially in intense or focused movement, you're not just distracting yourself, you're changing your physiological state. Your hormones shift, your focus sharpens, and the urge that once felt overwhelming begins to lose its intensity. It's not about escaping the feeling, it's about converting it into momentum. Over time, your brain starts to associate that surge of energy with action rather than indulgence. But redirection alone isn't enough if your identity stays the same. This is where the real transformation happens. If you continue to see yourself as someone who is trying to quit or struggling with control, you're reinforcing the idea that this is a constant battle. Your behavior will always feel like resistance, like you're going against your nature, and that makes it harder to sustain. Instead, you begin to shift your identity. You start seeing yourself as someone who is in control, someone who values discipline, someone who doesn't act on every impulse. This isn't just positive thinking, it's a psychological framework that shapes your decisions. When your identity changes, your standards change. Your actions naturally follow. This also means accepting that urges may still appear, but they no longer define you. They become something you experience, not something you obey. There's a difference between feeling an impulse and identifying with it. When you separate the two, you create space for choice. You're no longer reacting automatically, you're responding intentionally. Over time, this shift compounds. The more you act in alignment with your new identity, the stronger it becomes. The habits that once felt difficult start to feel natural. The behaviors that once pulled you in lose their appeal, not because you're forcing yourself to avoid them, but because they no longer match who you are. And that's the point where real freedom begins, not when the urge disappears completely, but when it no longer has the power to control your direction. So when you step back and look at everything we've covered, the message becomes very clear. This was never about fighting lust with brute force. It was about understanding it, breaking it down and removing the illusion that it's something uncontrollable. Because once you see how it works, how your brain forms patterns, how dopamine reinforces behavior, how triggers create automatic responses, you stop blaming yourself and start taking strategic control. You learn that awareness is your first line of power because you can't change what you don't notice. You understood that resisting urges isn't enough. You have to replace them with something stronger and immediate. You saw why your environment matters and how building systems can eliminate the need for constant willpower. And most importantly, you realize that this isn't just about removing a habit, it's about redirecting your energy and evolving your identity into someone who naturally makes better choices. Because the truth is, lust only dominates when it operates in the background of your life, when it's automatic, unexamined, and repeated without interruption. But the moment you bring it into awareness, the moment you challenge the pattern and start making intentional decisions, it begins to lose its grip. Not overnight, not instantly, but consistently, and in a way that actually lasts. And this is where most people get it wrong. They look for a quick fix, a single trick, something that will make the problem disappear. But real change doesn't come from shortcuts. It comes from small, repeated actions that rewire your brain over time. Every time you catch a trigger early, every time you redirect your energy, you feel a sense of accomplishment and a sense of freedom. Every time you choose alignment over impulse, you are literally reshaping how your mind works. So this is your turning point. Not because you'll never feel an urge again, but because now you know what to do when you do. You're no longer reacting blindly or responding with awareness, structure, and intent. And that shift changes everything because in the end, this isn't just about killing lust. It's about taking back control of your focus, your discipline, and your future. It's about becoming someone who doesn't just chase temporary pleasure, but builds a life that actually feels meaningful, powerful, and fully under your control.